Chapter 18. In the morning the work got underway in earnest. There was a fish net staked out a few hundred yards from the camp landing. When they sawed and split enough wood to last their mother several days, the boys started shoveling snow away from the net poles. The catch was only 9 fish. However, 2 of them were snakes, great northern pike that weighed 30 or 40 pounds apiece. The next 2 days they spent in following their father's traplines, first to the south and east, then westward to the head of the lake. The weather had been steadily cold. There was a good crust, so it was possible to use a dog sled. "Whose team will take, yours or mine?" Lindsay asked as they laid out the harness. "Neither one," Jim replied. "Not for working up the lake, anyway. We want that old husky of Dad's for a leader, because he knows the cubbies better than we do. My Paddy'll pull behind him, and we can take one of your dogs for the third." The makeshift team worked well together after 1 or 2 quarrels. It was a big help, as Jim had foreseen, to have at the head of the team a dog who was familiar with the location of the traps. Any good leader would stop at each cubby in turn, once he had been over the line a few times. They found no fur in any of the traps, and the weather grew steadily colder. By the end of the second day, the temperature had dropped to a point where it was hard to keep the dogs moving. They made camp in their father's cabin at the head of Wapping, and a roaring fire of logs in the stove kept them fairly warm that night. The next morning was one of the coldest in the winter. They had no thermometer, but Jim knew, the moment he felt the breath freeze on the fur of his hood, that the dogs would never go on such a day. They ate breakfast and waited for the sun to get up, in hopes it would be moderate. Finally, Jim took his axe and went over to the fish net. He cut one pole out after an hour's labor, and was starting towards the other when he realized there was no feeling left in his face. He stopped quickly, chafing one cheek with his mitten. Numb. He left the pole on the ice and started back to the cabin at a run. There was some loose snow under the hole in the crust by the door. Jim picked up a double handful and began rubbing it on both cheeks. Slowly a burning sensation came under the skin. A fierce biting pain tortured his face. Only then did he stop chafing the frozen skin and go inside the cabin. Lindsay looked up from getting lunch. "Frostbite? Here, don't come anywhere near the stove. Better keep over there by the stove till the ache goes out of your face." They stayed in cabin the rest of the day. With somewhat more warmth in the air next morning, they were able to pull the net and pack a dozen more fish in the sled. Then Lindsay took the trail down the lake with the dogs, while Jim swung north. He wanted to get over an outlying line of his father's that lay overland across the hills. He tramped along through the open birch and poplar growth, enjoying the winter sunshine. None of the traps held any fur, but he saw several moose. One was a small calf, strayed from his mother. It was so frightened and confused as Jim approached, it was tearing up an almost perpendicular hillside, missing its footing and tumbled halfway to the bottom again before getting its awkward legs untangled. Jim reached the home cabin at 5 o'clock that night. He had passed Joe Leake's shack at dusk, wading through a great pile of scraped moose hair that lay on top of the snow like tumbled haysack. It made him almost physically sick to figure the number of moose that had been slaughtered by the Cree that winter. Some of the Indians' dogs yelped at him as he went past, but the cabin door was not opened and he hurried on without stopping. Lindsay had reached home before him and was reading a book by the lamp when Jim stamped in. The older boy was tired and gruff. "That all you got to do?" he asked. "I thought with all afternoon at home you'd have the bapchee almost made." "Huh?" grunted Lindsay. "I only came in an hour ago. Lead dog went lame halfway down the lake and I made slow time. Besides, Ma says Dad and the girls won't be home till Sunday, so we got a couple days to cut hide. Bapchee is an Indian name for snowshoe filler. It has to be made each winter in large enough quantities to fill all the frames used by family. For daily use, all over all kinds of surface wears out the woven thongs." Jim had learned the art from his Ojibwe friends, the Lagarde boys. Before breakfast he went out to the shed and brought in the frozen hide of one of the young bulls they had killed in the autumn. He laid the stiff skin on a rack of poles above the stove and left it there for a couple hours, while he and Lindsay ate their morning meal and did their chores. Then, when the hide was thawed out and became flexible, he draped it over a shanting pole set up in the yard. In a temperature of 20 or more below, it soon began to stiffen again. While the hide was freezing, the boys searched in the shed for the upper foreleg bone of a moose, saved for the purpose. This they split lengthwise with an axe, so that the edge of the bone was almost like razor sharp. Now began the hardest part of the job. Jim held the end of the bone knife with both hands and pulled it towards him over the surface of the hide like a draw shave. The coarse, dry brown hair were cut away cleanly, leaving hardly a sign of stubble on the frozen skin. Every few minutes the edge of the bone grew dull and had to be trimmed again sharp with a hunting knife. When all the hair had been removed, the hide was thawed out again and sewn into a big wooden frame, 6 foot square. Then they placed it outside to freeze once more. It was mid-afternoon before it was frozen hard enough for the second scraping. Jim whetted an axe until the blade was almost keen enough to split a hair. It had to be handled carefully to avoid cutting gashes in the skin. Holding the head of the axe in one hand and the heft in the other, he began scraping the board-like hide. First, the outer layer of skin was cut away, right down to the root of the hair. Then, the inner surface was likewise scraped clean. What remained was the toughest part of the hide, 1/8 of an inch thick. That night, they took the skin out of its frame and cut it into long, even strips about the width of Jim's little finger. When it was wet and stretched, it would become narrower, but for the time being, it was finished babchi. The second hide was prepared and cut up the following day, and by nightfall they had enough rawhide strips to fill all the snowshoes they owned. Sunday, as always at Wabing, was a day of rest. The boys took baths, helped their mother with the cooking, and spent the rest of the time reading. Big Lindsay and the girls arrived that afternoon, rosy and hungry from their journey down the lake. "Well, boys," said their father when the evening lamp was lit, "season's about over. 2 more days left in February, so we'll all have to start springing traps tomorrow. We've done fairly well amongst us this winter. If we have a good muskrat season, we'll make out just fine. I heard in Nakina that rats bring $1.25 this year." Since Jim had already sprung the traps on half his line, he waited over a day to take up his father's traps along the north shore of Wabing. The following morning, the last of February, he got an early start for the squaw. It had started cold and the going was fast on the well-broken trail. He used his own team of Bruno and Pat, both fat and strong from their long rest. By the time he reached his home camp that night, he had a half load of traps taken from Porcupine Lake line, and there was a mink and 2 ermine to add to his store of fur. He routed the team out at 3 o'clock next morning and mushed down the river, collecting traps as he went. It rained a little, and the warm weather made the going soft in the afternoon. For the next 2 days, he had to do all of his work in the early morning before the slush could thaw. It was when he was approaching his home camp the last morning of the trip that he saw 2 good-sized timber wolves come out of the brush ahead of him. The dogs stopped in their tracks, silent but uneasy, and watched the big gray beast trot out onto the ice not 50 yards away. Jim hurried back to his sled. Foolishly, he had piled traps on top of his rifle, which lay in its deerskin-covered case near the middle of the toboggan. With one eye on the wolves, he tried to get the gun out without upsetting the load of traps. They stood there watching him until the moment he succeeded in pulling the rifle free, then both turned and made for the woods at an easy lope. There he timed their exit so perfectly he had barely whipped the stock to his shoulder when they disappeared. "Not very smart," he growled to himself. "Not smart enough for these babies anyway. They just stood and grinned till the gun came in sight." For the rest of that journey he carried the rifle in the crook of his arm. Lindsay was waiting for him at the cabin. The boy had finished picking up his own traps the night before and came down the river that morning. Between them, they had 4 mink to wind up the winter season. They skinned them that afternoon and were ready for bed by sundown. Traveling with the dogs at this time of year meant a definite change of schedule. They moved well enough while the surface of snow was frozen, but by noon each day the sun was likely to make the going sticky. Consequently, the boys kept much of the same hours as a city milkman. They rose long before dawn and went to bed about 5 or 5:30. Getting up at 3, they made the run to Waba over the crust next morning. That was the 4th of March. That afternoon, the next 3 days, they spent cutting and hauling the spring's wood. On the 8th, with 3 teams of dogs, the whole family except Miss Vanderbeck made an early start for Nikina. They knew the fur buyer was to be in town that day, so they went straight through without stopping. On the level crust, the girls and Big Lindsay were able to ride the sleds part of the way, but for Jim and his brother, the trip was 35 miles of steady hiking. When they reached the village, an hour after sunset, they discovered how fortunate this forced march had been. The buyer was leaving on the morning train, and a delay would have cost them a chance to dispose of their furs. As it was, the combined catch of the family was sold for a little over $350. They were able to send off an order for supplies on the same train that carried that shrewd fur merchant back to civilization. The boys enjoyed the luxury of lying in bed till 9 o'clock next morning, and what was left of the day they spent resting and visiting their friends in town. But on the 10th they had to get to work again. There was a small log ice house in the rear of their home at Nikina, and a few hundred yards away down the hill there was a pond of clear water. At breakfast that morning, Big Lindsay cocked a quizzical eyebrow at his sons. "Seems to me I recall you fellers like ice cream on Sunday morning dinner in the summertime," he remarked. "Guess maybe we better get that ice house filled up." Going at the job with a will, the boys soon had the snow cleared off an area of the pond 20 or 30 foot square. Then they chopped a hole through the ice and went to work with a big saw. When the ice had been cut into cubes, 2 foot on a side and about the same in thickness, each block had to be lifted out of the water and pulled up the hill on a sled. It took the next 2 days to finish stacking it in the ice house. Then another 2 days were spent hauling sawdust from town to pack around the ice. The dogs got plenty of work that week, for no sooner was the ice house filled than they had to start hauling in wood for the summer. On March 16th, the provisions they had ordered from Port Arthur arrived at the freight station. That was a signal for still more concentrated labor. The supplies were brought over to the storehouse and sorted into a number of sled loads, each to be taken to a different line camp for the spring rat trapping. Jim and Lindsay were the first to start back into the bush. They got away at dawn, their sleds piled with the potatoes, carefully wrapped in blankets and tarps. A quick run brought them to Poplar Lake, and they stopped at Lindsay's camp, for there was a danger of freezing their precious cargo if they went too far. At noon next day they pulled in at Waba camp with the potatoes still in good shape. Things had been happening in their absence, they found. Over in the corner of the warm room lay Blackie, the female husky left behind when the other dogs made the trip to Nikina. She growled at the boys but made no move to rise. "Hey, Ma!" cried Lindsay, pulling off his parka. "What's old Blackie doing in the house? It's bad for sled dogs, Dad says." Miss Vanderbeck chuckled. "Hush there, boy," she said, "and don't go off half-cocked. She's got much as right to be here as you have. Look at this." In a box under the edge of the pole bed were 5 squirming bits of black and grey. "Sure," said Jim. "Didn't you know she was going to have 'em? Say, they're whoppers, too, big and handsome. How many he-ones in the litter, Ma?" "3, she replied. "I suppose that's all we'll keep. Too bad when they're all doing so fine." On the 19th, the boys got up and away by 4 in the morning. The frozen trail was fast, and they rode the sled all the way to town, making the journey in less than 6 hours. Not bad with only 2 dogs to a sled, Jim commented. Of course, Emil did it last winter in 3 hours and 50 minutes, but those 4 police dogs of his are practically a race team. There was a day's delay in Nakina for 1 or 2 more purchases to arrive. It was the warmest day they ever had. Melting snow made a steady drip from the eaves, and the sun blazed down on pools of water in the road behind the station. When the whole Vanderbeck clan started for Wapping next morning, the temperature was still above freezing. "Take it careful, boys," warned Lindsay. "The ice won't be so solid on the streams after a thaw like this." Jim nodded and led off down the trail to Courtney Lake. On his toboggan, in addition to his own duffel, were 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline. It would be used in the outboard motor later in the spring when the lakes opened up. The boy was proud of his team. He knew old Bruno, with the sturdy Pat behind him, could outpull any of the other pairs, and once they were out on the lake, he lengthened his stride. When he rounded the first bend to Cranberry River, the rest of the convoy was out of sight, half a mile behind. Then, without slightest warning, came catastrophe. One moment, Jim was hiking along down the middle of the river, humming a song. The next found him plunged over his head in icy water. A patch of rotten ice had given way under his weight and left him fighting for his life in the swift-moving current.